think that's what makes deconverting so complicated, is that there's a lot of mixed feelings, and the feelings aren't all happy or I'm liberated. There are feelings of sadness and loss, and this is one of the reasons also why my friend and I are doing the podcast, because we really want to talk about that.
Welcome to Voices of Deconversion. We share the inspirational stories of deconversion told by former Christians who are now atheist or agnostic. Our stories remind us we're in it together. They encourage us as we discover who we are and help us to embrace who we become. Now here's Steve with today's guest.
Welcome back for episode 41. Before I introduce today's guest, I just want to say it's great to be back with everybody. We normally post an episode every other week, and it's been about 3 weeks now. Much of that time was spent helping family members move, but we also had my 101-year-old grandmother pass away. That's what's been, on our minds the last few weeks. So it's been busy, but things have kind of settled down now, so I'm glad to be back. So let me go ahead and introduce my guest today. So my guest today, she grew up in a non-denominational church, and it had traditional gender roles and was conservative in that sense. It was charismatic. It had, the gifts of the Spirit and things like that. One of the unique things that she brings up is this idea that the church is the bride of Christ. But as a girl growing up in the church, she talks about how she internalized that and understood that. And I thought that her perspective was really interesting and unique in terms of being in a close relationship with Christ, but specifically as a woman, what that meant to her. Later in her deconversion, this plays a big role because not only is she just believing something different when she becomes a non-Christian, but now she's losing a really important relationship. And that's a thing that a lot of us have felt or experienced when we deconverted. There are a succession of events in her deconversion process over years, and I won't spoil her story, but the thing that I really liked, one of the things that left the biggest impression on me after talking with her, was when she described what for her was the last straw. She has a conversation with a Christian woman who took her out to lunch. She was new to the church, and so this woman invited her out to lunch, and they have this really interesting conversation. And the way she talks about it in our interview today, she says that, it seems trivial or it doesn't seem like it should be that big of a deal, but having heard her story, her entire story building up to that point, it made a lot of sense to me and really was fascinating to me how that became a moment when she realized that she didn't want to go to church anymore. That in particular I found really to be actually kind of a powerful story. Now, in addition to her story, she is also starting a podcast with her friend Christine. So they co-host Forsaking Faith, which is a podcast that she'll talk about. And later in the interview, she describes kind of what it's about and what their goals for the podcast are and why they started it. If you want to connect with them, they are active on social media, so you can look them up on Facebook under Forsaking Faith or on Twitter at Forsaking Faith. And you can also email them, forsakingfaith@gmail.com. And now here's my interview with Heather Bailey. All right, well, I would like to welcome Heather Bailey to the Voices of Deconversion podcast. Heather, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, so the first question I usually ask people is how they identify now that they're not Christian. So do you go by the term atheist, or is there another term that you prefer to use?
So I actually use the term agnostic because I do think that there is still always the possibility that perhaps, there's a higher being. So that's the term that I usually prefer. And this is something that we could maybe get into more, but I am not, it's also interesting, I'm not really out, if I can, sort of use that term, to a lot of the people that I know. So that's an interesting question because for a lot of my family and friends from my hometown, I would kind of just go along with the idea that I'm still a Christian and not necessarily, make that statement. So, but yes, I identify as agnostic. Christine, who I know you'll be interviewing in the future, has a slightly different take on this. So it's interesting. But anyway, yes, that's how I identify.
Yeah, no, it's a simple question. And sometimes I'm like, should I really ask that? I mean, usually people say atheist. Sometimes they say agnostic atheist or agnostic or something. But I always feel like everybody who has deconverted has thought that through pretty thoroughly for themselves. So I actually think it's interesting hearing different people answer that. Some people are very adamant, and then other people are like, I really just, it's not a big deal, or I prefer this or that term, So
Right.
I know we're going to get into talking about your podcast later, but you mentioned that you are not totally out about your agnosticism to your family. So that's really interesting to me because you're starting a podcast. So how's that going to work? Are you just going to kind of keep it on the down low, or?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I will keep it on the down low initially, and then, but I do think it's something that I'm going to have to kind of contend with soon anyway. So perhaps in a subconscious way, I am, gearing up for that, for having those conversations, and the podcast will be a good way to do that. And I have thought about that because, we do have a social media presence already. And so I've been so far just selective about who I invite to like my the podcast for Facebook page. But of course, there's always a possibility that someone in my family could see it. And so what I'm hoping happens, I'm prepared for that. I assume that will end up becoming something that I'll have to confront more head on. And I'm hoping that maybe the podcast will actually help me do that, because I can say to my parents, for example, why don't you listen to one of the episodes, and this will give you a good sense of what I've experienced and what I'm going through.
Yeah, it's a very non-threatening way to kind of have them hear your side of it and hear what you went through, I think. Yeah.
Right. Especially because and I think you're probably similar. My partner and I's approach to the podcast isn't a particularly combative approach, and we were really deliberate about that we didn't want it to be a Christianity is all terrible. Although we have many critiques of it, absolutely, and I don't know if that's something you want to ask me about, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But we didn't want it to just be a Christian bashing or even organized religion bashing podcast. So I think I'm hoping it will actually facilitate those conversations with my family members.
Yeah, no, that's great. There's plenty of atheist podcasts that and sometimes I think they're really, really important to have out there, but there's a lot of them that do debates or really get into the nitty gritty about the details of why Christianity is incorrect and stuff like that. So podcasts like yours are definitely needed. So it's really neat that you're taking that angle,
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start kind of getting into your story a little bit. So can you just paint the picture for us? How was Christianity a part of your childhood, and how did it influence you?
So I self-identify as coming from a Christian, fundamentalist, or in a if I'm joking, I'll say crazy Christian church. But Christian fundamentalist is obviously the sort of more accurate term. It was a non-denominational church, so my home church was not affiliated with any particular denomination. It was a very small, very it was charismatic, so we believed in all of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, including speaking in tongues, getting slain in the Spirit, etc. And I don't know. I'm not sure. Would you like me to explain what those things are, or do you assume you're?
Sure. Why not just like a basic, just in case someone who's listening is not familiar with that.
Okay. So, this will be fun. So, speaking in tongues is an experience in which you, as a Christian, believe that God is, moving in you, and you are actually speaking in the language of the angels, essentially. And there's a moment in the book of Acts where a group of apostles are speaking in front of a crowd, and the story goes that the Holy Spirit descended on them, and they started speaking in lots of different languages. So that's where the concept comes from. So, and being slain in the Spirit is an act where you someone who is a vessel of the Lord touches you, and you essentially fall. You can either fall over, or you just get affected in a sort of a physiological way, because the Holy Spirit is supposedly being transferred from that person to you. So I've experienced both of those things. We had dancing in our church, so I was on the dance team along with my friend Christine. We were both on the same worship group. So and I can talk more about that in detail if you want to know more about that. But every Sunday morning we performed, got up and danced during our worship service, and that was a really big part of my adolescence, all the way through to my early college years. I was very involved in that dance team.
Oh, wow.
So yeah. So it's a really big part of my church experience. And what else? It was a very, very traditional church in terms of gender roles, which is something that I have lots of critiques of now. And it's one of the things I think was the most toxic about my background. So, there were no females in positions of leadership. We had a board of elders, all men. I heard lots of very in my opinion, problematic things about gender growing up. So, my family as well, because my family is also Christian fundamentalist. That was the relationship that was modeled for me.
So in your home, but also in the church, it was normal. It was just the way things were. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's a good overview.
Okay.
Do you want to know, but are there specific questions?
Well, yeah, let's dive into that just a little bit. So you were obviously really involved from a young age. So your earliest memories are being raised in a Christian home.
Yes.
And how did, as you said that being on the dance team was a really big part of your adolescence and early college years. So talk about that and tell me why was that such a big part of your growing up?
Yeah. Okay. So the reason, it started when I was young. I joined, and this is probably not going to be surprising to you, because I wanted to be popular. And in my very small world, in my small social circle, that everyone that I knew, everyone that I was friends with, and everyone that I interacted with in this community were all Christians. So everyone I knew was on this dance team. Everyone who was cool. So the pastor's daughter was very cool in our church, and actually the older daughter. Our pastor had 3 daughters, so the one was close to my age, but his oldest daughter ran the dance team. So it's so interesting. It functioned in just in the same way that high school does. It kind of was its own microcosm, within the church, and so I joined for that reason. I joined because I wanted to be like those women. They were popular in my social circles, and they were pretty, and et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to be like them. When I became involved, so that continued to be one of the factors, just the sense of community, the sense of friendships, but also dancing in church did have. I did genuinely feel like I was communing with God while I was dancing, and I'm not sure I'm not sure specifically what your particular Christian background is, or your listeners. So
yeah. I'll stop you real quick just to tell you that I was raised in, so I had experience as well with a few different churches, but Some of the churches that were really, I want to say fundamental, but just really key, like big part of my high school years were charismatic churches. So, and I've actually had a few guests on that were from non-denominational churches. So I think there's quite a few people listening that are either familiar with it or are going to be super curious about it because it's just so weird.
Right.
But I was in churches where there was dancing like that, tongues. I was slain in the spirit, spoke in tongues for a brief moment, but it was weird for me. So then I stopped, but did plenty of other weird things. So, so that's kind of, I think you're kind of in an environment where people who are listening are going to be somewhat familiar and understand a little bit where you're coming from.
Okay, awesome. So, so then this will sound familiar to a lot of us, the listeners, which is that the concept that as a woman, you are, worship and communing with God and dancing with God was characterized as a kind of marital romantic experience. We were, Christ, God was our lover, Jesus. It was sort of colored in those terms. I don't know if you're familiar with this song that came out called Dance With Me. It was a song by Paul Wilbur, and it was really popular in sort of the Christian fundamentalist circles I operated in. I think it's probably still pretty popular, but it's a song. Anyway, it's a song that takes verses from the Song of Solomon and, put them to music. And so we performed a dance where we were literally performing essentially like a marriage. It was supposed to be, Christ and
his
the
bride,
church. Right. But we as women, as female dancers, are sort of embodying that kind of, that we were like the brides. So what's really interesting, and I think that this is really gendered, which makes it interesting. In other words, I just mean, I think it's a specific experience that women have had that maybe men haven't experienced so much, which is that I really felt like God, Jesus, was a kind of lover for me. And I really internalized that. I really embodied that. It was a kind of, it was like a kind of romantic experience is the only way I can think to describe it.
Yeah.
So that had huge ramifications for me when I came out of the church, because I had lost, and it's interesting, I talk to people and I describe it like a breakup in many ways, the process of deconverting. It was like I have to give up this, essentially a relationship that I thought that I was in.
Yeah.
And so it just kind of, it had that, so that had a really deep rooted effect. And it's something that while I'm sure it sounds really crazy coming out of my mouth, but at the, there's a part of me that still, misses that, even though I don't want to be part of it anymore. I don't believe in it. I don't agree with it. But there is like I think that's what makes deconverting so complicated, is that there's a lot of mixed feelings, and the feelings aren't all happy or I'm liberated.
Yeah.
There are feelings of sadness and loss. And this is also something that this is one of the reasons also why my friend and I are doing the podcast, because we really want to talk about that, focus on that angle of it, because I think it's not always, it is good overall, but
no, that's awesome. I mean, that was a huge part of my experience was, one of the things I really missed the most was not being able to pray. Like I would be driving in my car. I was actually in Bible school when I deconverted, like going to be a pastor. Oh, wow. And so like, I remember like when I'd kind of realized, and it took my wife saying, I don't think you're a Christian anymore, for it to like wake me up. I was completely like blocking that part off of my brain so that I was just trying to survive, I think, like spiritually or whatever. But I remember driving in my car, during that time of life and wanting to pray. Like whenever you're in crisis or in a difficult situation as a Christian, you pray about it and you reach out to your best friend in heaven to help comfort you and give you comforting ideas that help you feel better or whatever. So that definitely was a big loss for me. And so I think it's really important that you're talking about that.
Yeah, I can absolutely relate to what you're saying about prayer as well. Yeah, I did you find yourself doing it, continuing to do it without realizing it? Because I've done that. I'll sometimes have these moments.
I think I would kind of start, or like, God, if you're there, or I know you're not there, and then it would just fizzle out. Like, this is stupid. Why am I doing this? But then there's that huge loss. Like, you needed that. I needed that in my past to help me cope with difficult situations. So now my coping mechanism's gone. So now what? And then you feel really alone and.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. That is very hard. It's scary. It's scary to have to accept that there's not, so this is another thing that I more have had to grieve the loss of, which is a sense of order in the universe.
Yeah.
And that's, the prayer is part of that. Like, this idea that anything negative that happens to you, you can always reframe it as, I'm being tested by God, or, everything's going to work out eventually. Or even if it doesn't, I know where I'm going when I die. Right. So it's very scary to have to sort of reframe
your thoughts.
Yeah, reframe your thoughts, but without a guide.
Right.
Anymore.
Yeah,
so.
It's insane. I think this may come out really dumb, this analogy, but I always think of analogies. They're not always good. But I told my wife one time, it's like I was on a path, like in the forest, and like had the family with me, because we had 2 young kids at the time. They were really little, like 3 and 4 years old when this all was happening. So like the family was depending on me being like the breadwinner, like pastor, and my wife was just going to stay home and raise kids. That was like the plan.
Right.
But I told my wife, it was like I was walking on this like sure path through the forest, like this is the way my life's supposed to go. I knew the path. I knew where I was going. And then all of a sudden it's like I looked around me and like there's no path anywhere. And like I don't know where to go. I don't know where the path's at. Even if I head in a direction, I don't know if it's the right direction. It's that complete sense of just disorienting, just don't know where to go, like feel almost paralyzed by like not knowing what to do,
Yes, I completely relate. I liked that analogy.
Oh. Yeah. Well, that's how it felt when I was thinking about it one time, and I'm like, right. Yeah, you're just completely stuck, like you don't, like I didn't even know, like, well, what do I want to do with my life now, like, and didn't really have time to think about that, because when you're raising a family, you have to go get a job. So I ended up getting a job at like a call center, just because it was like the best paying job I could find, and yeah, it's so different from like this path of certainty I was on, so I get the lost part. Yeah. Well, let's get back into your story a little bit. So how did your faith mature and develop from kind of those adolescent years forward?
So I really, I followed the path, I would say, in my early adult years that you're supposed to follow when you're a devout Christian. So in order to sort of further develop my relationship with God, I did a lot of things like, Bible studies, prayer and meditation, we called it, which is kind of funny now that I do now do some meditation in a totally different context. But anyway,
yeah.
It's just funny that we used that word
right.
in particular. But, so contemplating the scripture, studying the scripture more thoroughly. And again, just like with any romantic or otherwise, just any close long-term relationship, that's how I conceptualized it. And so I, sort of did the thing that you do in any long-term relationship where you, spend time with the person that you're in a relationship on a regular basis. You quote unquote like work through things. So in my case, it would be me having doubts, or and you get to know the person more, which of course for Christians is reading more of the Bible and talking to mentors. I developed relationships with older women in our church who are, trying to be, mentors to me. So I did all of those things, and for a while I felt satisfied with that, even though things were happening in my life that I wasn't happy about, but it did ground me. And I think this would be an interesting, I wonder about this. I don't know like what the data, there's obviously no like data necessarily to back this up, but I do wonder like if personality type also plays into this, because I'm very much a type A person. And so I also think that having that kind of stability and structure, like I like structure, I like authority figures, I like rules. Even now, I will, if my, I work at a university. So if our department chair sends out an email and says you need to have these forms turned in by a certain time, I am the person that turns them in immediately, unlike some of my other colleagues. So anyway, I also think that it suited my personality well, and it'll be interesting when you talk to my partner for the podcast, because she has a very different, she has a very different personality to mine. And so she had doubts much earlier. And I think that was part of it. So
that's interesting. I like the type A thing though, because I think I'm more that way. My wife is not as much that way. And for her, what was difficult was our life being like in upheaval and stuff, but she didn't like miss God as much. Like for me, it was like I was depending on him, and so it was a different experience for hers. Hers was definitely very difficult. I'm not taking anything away from what she went through, because it was super hard for her too. But yeah, the type A thing, I think it makes it difficult in unique ways if you're that way.
Yeah, because then again, when I deconverted, the loss of stability was particularly hard for me, I think, given that. So, but anyway, so I did all those things, and I'm sure you can relate to a lot of those, especially like the Bible studies and all of that. I essentially did everything that a good Christian woman should do. I was very, I didn't do no drugs, no alcohol, no sexual experienes. I mean, I was I was my parents' dream at that point,
Yeah, fundamentalist parents' dream, right?
Yes. I was just a really straight-laced person. So I really did embrace all of it, the lifestyle and the practice that goes into, being a devout Christian.
Mm-hmm. Well, up to this point, what else was significant about your life?
That's a really good question. So not very much else. And what I mean by that is that the church was essentially all of my life. And I think that was, again, part of the issue later, just like what made it challenging later. So I didn't really have a lot of other interest. I mean, I loved reading, and that's why I'm now a literature, getting my PhD in English literature. So, that that certainly, I could see that influence. I loved reading, but I also mostly, at this stage, was reading Christian romance novels, which someday, if I have time, I really want to write like a nonfiction essay on Christian, like the genre of Christian romance novels, because it's really fascinating to me from a cultural perspective.
Yeah.
And it just so, because it's such a big moneymaker. It's such a big industry, even now. And it really, anyway, it continued to kind of fuel a lot of the problematic views that I had on like relationships and romance and stuff. because these novels were essentially, it's funny, they're essentially, erotica for Christians.
Yeah.
So, there's no sex, but there's all of the other things that a paperback romance novel has, like archetypes and, very traditional gender roles, like women who are sort of in distress and, need rescuing. And then there's like conversion, stories where someone is, in love with someone and they're not a Christian. And so their resolution is that the person becomes a Christian. It's really interesting. Again, it's funny that now I think probably because I'm a literature scholar, this makes sense. I actually really like talking about this from that perspective, from a literary studies perspective.
Yeah.
But anyways, so I read a lot of those. But I did, I'm trying to think what else. I really, from a young age, was really independent in some ways. Like I liked to travel and stuff. So that became more significant as I got older. In my, I actually did a foreign exchange program after high school.
Where'd you go?
I went to Brazil.
Oh, cool.
Which is really cool. And I think...
Did you have any Portuguese? Like, did you know any Portuguese?
I did not before I went. And I just got on a plane. I can't believe my parents let me do this. I just got on a plane and I went to Brazil for a year. Lived with host families.
Wow.
Yeah, I was
17.
a
good experience for you?
It was. And I think it was the beginning of doubt, although it took a long time. But because when I was there, I did go to church a couple of times while I was there, but I didn't go to church very often just because my host families weren't attending church and I was totally dependent on them.
Yeah.
And I didn't really miss it that much. And yeah, so I think that was I didn't, obviously at the time I wasn't sort of cognizant of that, but I think that was the beginning of the seeds, at least, of doubt.
Yeah. Well, before we jump into the doubts, because that's definitely kind of the next step, I think. Was there a person in your life that you would say influenced your faith the most?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, I really admired the older pastor's daughter. And I guess I'm not going to say names. I don't know that anyone we know would be listening to this now, like from that community, but just in case. But
sure.
She was just a very, very charismatic person, very, very, very smart, very like a go-getter. So she just, would come in and, sort of take charge of her room, which was really interesting because obviously but then of course in weird ways she was still very traditional, like got married very young, had kids very young. She's such an interesting person. I think if she had grown up in a different environment, she would have been like a high power lawyer or a successful politician.
Wow.
And so it's interesting. I have such weird feelings about her now because at the time that I was close with her, I admired her for all of these traditional things. I mean, I wanted to be her. So I wanted to be the woman that she, got married when she was 21 and had, several kids right away. And a woman who talked about her, ultimately, obeying her husband and, listening to her husband and these kinds of things. And yet there was like an undercurrent in her, like an underlying energy that was really it was really steely and strong that I think maybe I was also responding to, but again, sort of not really aware at that age. But now as I'm looking back,
that was something you could sense that in her and admired that and maybe wanted to be similar or just admired her characteristics. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. But she really, and still, she's a very, really warm person, very invested in people. yeah, she really cared about all of us. And I still, I have occasionally interact with her on social media and things.
Mm-hmm.
And I did see her briefly. She was actually at my sister's wedding. So that was the last time I saw her a few years ago. And we had a nice exchange. So I'm happy that we're on good terms. And I still have a lot of respect for her.
That's nice. I mean,
which is good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it sounds like she's a close family friend still.
Yeah, we are. My family, so my parents actually, so none of my family actually lives in the hometown I grew up in anymore. My parents actually moved to a different city and about 10 years ago now. And I have two siblings and all of us are now in our, late 20s. So we're all living in different cities. So it's interesting. We do still have those connections to our home church. I think things would be much different if my parents were still in our hometown. And I think about that sometimes, like what my relationship would be to my home church, that church.
Yeah. If everybody was still around.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But this woman, she was a little bit older than you. So she was kind of like a mentor then in a way.
Yes. Yeah. She's about 10 years older than me, maybe a little bit more, maybe 10 to 15 years older. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Well, so let's get into the doubts a little bit. So, thus far in your story, things have kind of been going along. You're like the perfect Christian daughter, so to speak. And you're not even realizing that some of these things, like not missing church when you're in Brazil, are kind of there. So tell me when you first became aware of doubts in your life.
So, yeah, so it started, this is going to sound really cliche, but it started, I think, mainly with college. And really, I think with just it was the first time ever, because I was so sheltered, just to give you a little bit of context, so my hometown is very, very small, very rural, and in a rural area in the state of New York. And my church was very small, and I attended my church's school. So my entire social circle was other Christians. I did not interact with anyone at any level aside from salespeople. I mean, that was really it. Who were not Christians and who were not Christian fundamentalists.
Okay,
so it was really,
it was a Christian college then.
Oh no, that was high school. So
sorry, I mixed that up.
That's okay. No, that's okay. So when I started attending college, it was such a big shift for me because I actually started, talking to people who weren't Christians. But what's interesting is that it wasn't a quick, I know some students, now I'm an instructor and I see this, some students have a much sort of quicker turnaround where they're, they first semester in college, whatever, they're already like, they've rejected their religious upbringing. So that wasn't the case for me. I was still very much a Christian, and I was in college. I was that annoying student that I now, cringe when I think about, but the student that said really, really problematic things in my classes. I remember I took an ethics course and, had a whole thing about how I didn't support gay marriage and had a whole thing about how abortion was wrong, all these things. I was that student, but I did have friends who were not Christians and who were politically liberal and who I did talk to and become friends with. And so that was the real beginnings, I suppose. And so, okay, so trying to condense this. So, the thing that changed, thing that actually changed first for me wasn't the rejecting Christianity, but it was becoming more politically liberal.
Interesting.
So because that I'm going to betray my age, but I was in college when Obama won for the first time. So 2008, during that election. And that was actually when I stopped going to my church. But again, it wasn't because I was no longer a Christian. It was just, I was really upset with the fact that our church was, our pastor of our church was, sort of openly giving a running commentary on the election and, encouraging people to not vote for Obama and all these things. And I was already, on the basis of logic, rejecting even the gay marriage thing, even though I took that class. But, sort of after that happened, I was already questioning that kind of logic. I was already able to kind of say, oh, okay, this is what I believe personally, but I don't think that our legislation should, be a tool of Christianity. So then I became that kind of Christian, which you might know people like that still, even, where I was like, oh, well, I personally think that being gay is a sin, but, I don't think that we should, ban gay marriage. So it was like I was like in this medium in between space.
Yeah.
But then I wasn't at my home church anymore. So then I experimented. I went around to some other churches in the town, but that became difficult because our town is so small that all of the pastors know each other. So
interesting.
The pastor of this other church, that I and some of my other friends, because that's the other important factor here, is that some of my friends were doing the same thing. So we kind of collectively were like, let's go check out other churches. So that pastor called our pastor and said, why are all these people, young people, young adults suddenly coming to my church? And
that is really funny.
Right. Yeah. It sounds like the real, I don't know, Christians of, I don't know. It sounds like a reality TV show.
Right. Yeah.
So that was really off-putting. And so then I stopped going to church at that point. But again, I still hadn't quite come to the point of saying I'm not a Christian. It was just more like I'm fed up with the churches in my hometown. And I was doing the thing that, again, some Christians do or Christians who are questioning do, where, I was like, oh, I'm just fed up with organized Christianity.
Yeah. That's a nice gateway statement. Yeah.
Yes. So, I was like, oh, I just like, right. The fusion of church and politics, that's really problematic. And, all these things. So I did that. And then that's where I was at when I was done with undergrad. And is it okay if I keep going?
Oh, no, absolutely. Okay? Yeah. Okay. Keep. Okay. Yeah. Cause if you stopped, I would have said, okay. And then what?
Okay.
So,
okay.
Yeah, you're fine. Yeah.
So then I went to graduate school, and I went to graduate school in England, and in England's interesting because it was, this was pre-Brexit. So at least it was, again, more sort of, just culturally more left-leaning. And I loved that. But I did go to church there, and I actually found a church that was pretty conservative. It wasn't Church of England. It was like a non-denominational church. But even then, because it was in England, I was like, oh, I love that. Everyone in this church is, thinks that national health care is a good thing. Again, it was like the political stuff was appealing to me. And so there was that. But then, so I went to that church with a friend of mine who was also a graduate student. But what was interesting is over the course of the roughly year and a half that I was there, I started to notice that I was becoming less and less invested in going to church and kind of annoyed with lots of things that church was doing. And my friend wasn't. My friend was going in the opposite direction. It was interesting. She actually comes from a very, very liberal background, like secular home. And so she was like, we intersected because we were both wanting to go to this church. And then she kind of went in the opposite direction. She got really into it. She got baptized. She was like speaking in tongues, doing all of these things. And I felt so weird about it. It was strange. It was like, I was like, why am I not happier about this, about the fact that she's doing this? And so again, I was like getting there.
That's interesting. I've known people like that. It's really bizarre when you're going the other way and you're thinking like, how are you going that way? Like, how is that happening?
Yeah. Yeah, especially at our age, where again, this is like, I'm in my, mid-ish 20s at this point. So, I think especially at that, and we're both graduate students, so that demographic, it's just less likely that would be happening. Right. But, so I started to, and I remember this is a minor thing, but it stuck with me. My parents, I remember, sent this church money.
The church you were at, or?
Yeah, the church I was at in England.
They sent them money.
They sent them money. And I remember it infuriated me because they weren't helping me pay for grad school.
Oh, that's interesting.
And they did not tell me that they had done that. So I remember I was at dinner with the pastor of that church and his wife and my friend. And the pastor was like, "Oh, we just got this check from your dad." And it was just it just really didn't sit well with me because, first of all, I'm an adult and I felt like that was really patronizing that my parents are sending money. But also I was just really, really upset. And this continues to be a critique that I have of Christianity and of not just my parents, like other people who are, still very much a part of that world, which is that, there's this kind of valuing of the church even over other relationships, including, familiar relationships, that I just really disgusted me. I was, and so I think that was a sort of a defining moment too in my starting to reject Christianity. As a parent, I'm not a parent, but right now, but I could never imagine if I ever have kids, I could never imagine saying to myself, I know that my child is trying to further their education and they're living, they're having to take out loans, to pay for their living expenses. And I have some disposable income and I'm going to give this disposable income to a church, instead of to my kid to support them.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. I can understand what you're saying. Yeah, I think that could be kind of hurtful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that didn't sit well with me. I was definitely hurt by that. And then I was, again, and this is of course this is not just a problem with the church. This is a problem in any group that you're part of. But, that I was getting frustrated with the hypocrisy of just people that I interacted with at this church. And that wasn't sitting well with me. So then.
Yeah, so things are starting to pile up.
Plus I'm getting better educated. And that's a big, that is another thing that I think really you can't discount is, the importance of getting an education. This is part of why getting an education is so important, because you encounter different ideas and you learn how to think logically. And so as I was getting better educated, and also really that was the first time that I was really living as an adult in this other country, graduate student, which is very different than being an undergraduate in a lot of ways. There's a lot more responsibility. And I study My area of expertise is early modern literature, which is 16th and 17th century literature. So I'm also studying the commissioning of the King James translation of the Bible, these kinds of things. So I'm becoming more and more aware of how much the Bible is a construct.
Oh, yeah. That was big for me.
And,
yep.
Yeah. Which, of course, is something that you don't learn when
Right,
you're growing up in our background.
Yeah. Fundamentalists don't talk about how the Bible was pretty much pieced together over years. Yeah.
There was no, you might have had a similar experience. Like there was no any kind of there was not any kind of academic approach to studying the Bible at all in my background. I mean, it was just, this is the Word of God, and everyone who contributed to the one of the books of the Bible was all, I guess, like, if you will, on the same Holy Spirit inspired wavelength.
Yeah.
And so there's this continuity, and so when I started to study literature, and I mean, it's just so interesting because what I do now as a literary scholar is all we do is think about cultural context.
Oh.
What is the context at which this text was written? What is the cultural, what's going on around the author? Who is the author? Is the author a man? That matters. Is he white? You know what I mean? These kinds of questions. So because I am trained to do that now, and I don't even just do it with literature. I mean, I do it with everything, movies. I mean, I deconstruct everything that I see essentially now. And so as I was becoming more trained, because literature was not my undergraduate major, so I shifted to literature. So as I was becoming more trained in this technique, this skill, if you will, that also had a big impact on my emerging doubts, because I was like, how can just one text be an exception to that?
Right.
To all of the other texts in the world, including other texts from other religions.
Right.
Which, and so I was like, this doesn't add up. This doesn't make any sense. So that was happening simultaneously. And then I came back to the States. I got a job in a different city I'll just say that I live in the southeast region of the United States now. So I got a job in a different city in this region, but I was still like, I just need to find the perfect church. And so I researched, and I found a church that was more progressive, if you will, in some of their doctrines. And I went to this church, and it's so funny that this is like the breaking point, but it really was. It's going to sound really trivial, but the breaking point ultimately for me was that I met this girl at this church who had also lived in England, and she was very friendly, like a very, as people are at a church when there's a new potential member.
Yeah.
And she had just had a baby, and she was being really sweet, and she was like, oh, let's go get lunch. And so I went to lunch with her, and she was talking, and the way that she was talking, it was like everything, all the women, the models of, femininity that I had grown up with. This woman was those things.
Okay.
And she had given up this very, and again, I won't like share details, but she had given up a very prestigious job in the UK to come back to the United States to get married and, have a baby. And
wow.
And again, this is not me saying
that's bad necessarily.
That's bad.
Right. No, yeah. But that tends to be really normal in fundamentalist Christianity. So,
yes. Yeah. And with this particular woman, I could see so clearly that she was unhappy. So this wasn't an example of a woman that was like, oh, I've done this, and actually I'm genuinely fulfilled by this. This was like, I am really conflicted about, this decision. And it was just so off-putting to me.
So was she putting up a front that everything was fine, but you could tell it wasn't fine?
Yeah.
Okay. So she wasn't like, oh my God, I made all these mistakes, and she took you out to lunch, like, to tell you. She was trying to play the part, and
Yes. Yes.
but you could see through it.
Yeah.
That is so
That's what I
sad.
found off-putting. Yeah, that's the part. That's what it was that I found
That's like
off-putting.
incredibly sad. It's like someone after a long period of their life saying pretty much like, I haven't done what I should have done with my life. That's like really sad. Yeah.
Yeah, and she just everything that her mannerisms, the way that she talked, the way that she dressed, was just this very like sweet, but it felt so much like a performance. Like I'm this like sweet, whatever, like motherly. Oh yeah, she was like really the way she was talking about her kid. And again, I have friends who have kids now. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
It was just her particular the sort of the dynamic of it just felt really off. And so I was like that. I think that was just the last straw in terms of me thinking this is about a church or about a community, because I was just like, I don't want any part of that anymore. That's the kind of model that I had of what it means to be a woman. That's the model that I grew up.
So Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's all I was gonna say. So I had come so far since then, and that was the moment of realization when I said I do not want to be that kind of woman.
Yeah. So I was just gonna say, like, it's like you were looking at someone, and if like who you should in the Christian fundamentalist world want to be, but for you at that point in your life, that would have been going backward.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
Not forward, and you had this idea of where your life, this trajectory your life was going to head toward, and she was representing the past essentially for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And there's a really big life lesson there in like looking across the table at someone, seeing, I mean, this may sound bad, but seeing what you don't want to be, and just recognizing like, I don't want that for my life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. And it's just was such a defining moment. It's so funny that it was such a small moment, but again, because of everything that had already happened to me, it was just kind of like that final culminating. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So then was that like a moment for you where you're like, okay, like I'm done, like I don't believe any of this, or was it still kind of evolving?
It was still kind of evolving, but that was the moment when I decided finally that I wanted nothing to do with like a church or, the Christian community. And so then for a few more months, I was sort of like, well, what do I believe? Do I believe in God at all? Et cetera, thinking through those things.
Mm-hmm. And
then I realized that I didn't. I mean, because at that point too, I had kind of stopped, mostly for the most part, stopped praying, and nothing happened. So I'd stopped going. I decided I didn't want to go to church. I had, I kind of stopped praying, and nothing was happening. There were no consequences. I was feeling okay. Other things in my life were going well. This was like the first job that I got out of grad school. I had I was in a new romantic relationship at that point. So, I was like, well, things are going well, and, there's nothing, I'm not getting any kind of message from God. Like, why are you, to warn me?
Yeah. It's like
that I'm headed down this.
Yeah. It's like you're doing all the wrong things in the Christian world, but all the right things are happening to you.
Right.
It's like life is telling you something totally different,
Yes. Yeah. So then that's the point at which I said, I really don't think I believe this. Although, like I said, I still think that there could be a higher power. I don't want to completely rule that out, but yeah, I decided that for those reasons, nothing is happening. There are no negative consequences. And also for the logical reasons that I had mentioned a little while earlier, like thinking about the Bible as a cultural construction, as a compiled list of texts from many different cultures and people. That combination is really what led me to ultimately say I definitely am not a Christian.
Yeah. And earlier you'd said, like, you talked about how dance was such a huge part of, and just like that growing up in the church, and how you really tried to live out, the Christian life. And that was a huge part of your early years, your adolescence. So what was, when you kind of decided you didn't really believe what believe in God anymore, is that accurate to say, like, you didn't believe in God anymore, or?
Yeah. And
Okay.
I think maybe more
you're not saying
specifically Jesus.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know you're not taking an absolute stance like there's absolutely no God. I've been to every corner of the universe and I know it. I think I think some atheists get that kind of bad reputation for being so absolute about it. So, but anyway, so when you realized that you didn't believe in God anymore, what was the most difficult thing for you transitioning from Christian to non-Christian?
For me, I think it was two things. One is, I think the biggest thing was the sense of chaos suddenly that I experienced in the world. Just the sense that, oh, something bad could happen to me for no reason. I guess maybe chaos isn't the right way of saying. I mean, it is. That is. It's not inaccurate to say that, but I guess more specifically, it's that I had this conception of fairness that was really ingrained in me because of my Christian beliefs. So, right. So this, like, the idea that, like, people ultimately are going to get what they deserve based on their, partly based on their actions, obviously also partly based on their faith. And even if it's in the afterlife, but, so it was suddenly like, well, wait a minute, this isn't the case. People are exploited, and people who are doing the exploiting are getting rich and, becoming successful. And obviously that's, like, huge in our country, that, people who are many of the wealthiest and most successful people in our country are terrible, by sort of a Judeo-Christian moral ethical standards. They're terrible people. Yeah. And so, whereas in the past, if I witnessed that happening, like, oh, someone is, this, whatever, a wealthy corporation owner is, a terrible person who's, ripping off his employees. Well, then I would think, yeah, but justice will come to him eventually. Right. He will either in this life, or he'll die and he'll go to hell. And so when I didn't have that anymore, it was just really scary to think about the world as just random and things, people doing whatever they want. Maybe they get rewarded, maybe not. And then also the other randomness of the world, like, I don't know, disastrous weather events and things like that. And the fact that you can get very sick suddenly, for no reason. So all of those things that I think it's interesting, people who I know who grew up in a secular household, they wrestled with all of these questions too, just much earlier. Like, I have friends who are like, oh yeah, like, I went through that phase when I was in middle school of thinking about how chaotic the world was. So I feel like I just had to do it all when I was much older. So there was that, and then obviously, and this is probably a common one that you hear, which is death was very difficult and is still very difficult for me to deal with and to process. And I am still not out of that yet. Like, I think my podcast partner, I think, has she does, because we have a podcast that's all about death. Her view is a little bit more crystallized and articulate, and she's, really developed a way of understanding death that's really beautiful. I am not there yet. I am still in the panic, anxiety. Sometimes I can't sleep because I start thinking about death mode, because it was just such a huge part of my life for so long. This idea that I'm going to go to heaven when I die. I'm going to have this eternal life that's going to be really beautiful. And so having to contend with that is definitely very difficult.
Yeah, I really associate with that piece. Believe it or not, I don't think it actually has come up too much. I mean, or that often on the podcast. So I'm glad you said something about it.
Mm-hmm.
I deconverted in 2005, so it's been a long time, but I haven't been totally okay. Like I struggled with like mental health stuff for a long time, and that doesn't help when you're trying to understand like death and cope with that type of thing. And but that's still, I mean, even for me all these years later, like I still, sometimes when I think about it, it really sucks, and you're just like, how do you make it when you're told that life has a fairy tale ending for you personally, and then you realize like there's nothing, like nothing will be there. That's a shock to someone's psyche,
Yeah.
So I really, really associate with what you said about that. Well, so what, I guess, helped you, maybe not as much with the death stuff, because you said you're still sort of working through that, but when you were talking about, realizing the world isn't always just, is there anything that's helped you kind of process that or cope with that idea?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm working through now, and this has helped me, is to think about the positive side to chaos, which is that every decision that I make is a decision that has a consequence, and it's on me rather than on some higher power. And that can be anxiety inducing in some ways, because there's a lot of pressure, but it can also be motivating. So I think that I am just a very proactive, motivated person. And I've always been organized. I've always been a type A person, but I don't know that I would be where I am today if I was still a Christian. I don't know that I would have decided to go back. So I, got a master's degree, then worked for a little while, and then I decided I wanted to go back and get a PhD. And it can also be really invigorating and really inspiring and really empowering to realize that I can, first of all, I have the freedom to make the decisions that I want to make, and that if I don't make these decisions, they're not just going to happen. It's not just going to materialize. And so it makes me a more proactive person. And so now I've become a person that I'm pretty proactive. And what I mean by that is if I see something that I want in life, I figure out or try to figure out how to get it. It doesn't mean I have unrealistic. I mean, obviously there's some things that are out of your control.
Sure.
But I just in general with things, with academics, with, I'll give you a recent example. I decided that I wanted to expand my friendship group. Like I hang out with a small group of friends, and then I said, they're great, but hey, it's healthy to have lots of friends and to have friends that aren't necessarily all in the same social group. And so I just, in my head, I didn't write it out necessarily, but just in my head,
Sure.
I kind of decided, okay, well, what can I do to get there, to get to that, to reach that goal? And I did it. And so now I'm like a much more social person now, and I have sort of like varied friends. And it's those kinds of things where I think, I 5 to 7 years ago, I just would have said, well, if God wants me to
Yeah.
If God wants this thing to happen, then it will happen. And so it can be really, really empowering.
Yeah, I that's a good word for it. It opens up the world to you, and you get to decide. There's no more trying to understand what God's will is. You get to decide what you do with your life, and you get to problem solve and try to come up with solutions for your life, and all sorts of different things. So that's a good answer. I like that.
And especially, I just want to add, especially as a woman, I think it's really particularly great because and I still check myself sometimes. I still find myself doing this thing where I'm like, oh, I should feel this way or should want this thing. And then have to go, no, I don't. And so, having kids is a good example. I really don't think that I want to have kids, and that it's still, I still get pushback from that, from various people, but it's just cool to for me to be able to say, wait a minute, I don't have to do this thing. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to be okay with, and even if I, do end up having a child someday, I don't have to be okay with just being a stay-at-home mom, because I 100% know I will not be happy doing that. And I don't want to do that. Yeah. And just being able to say that with confidence is really cool.
That's great. Yeah, that's a really positive thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, when you think back on the Christian you, what do you think about that person now?
That's also a really good question. Okay, so I definitely think I was really judgmental, for sure. Christine maybe will say more about this when you interview her, but she and I were not friends. We went to the same Christian high school, but we were not.
Oh, that is really
friends.
Funny.
Yeah, because Christine was a little bit too, wild for me, in quotes. Using quotes. Anyway, I'll let her say more about that if she wants to. But so I was really, I was very dismissive of anyone that did not subscribe, wholeheartedly to being a traditional Christian woman. And it's really judgmental. I think I was also really in denial about a lot of things. That this is another positive thing coming out of Christianity, is that I'm a lot more okay with being honest and real with people, even if it's negative. Because this might be, you might have experienced this too. Like in Christian fundamentalism, there's a tendency to be positive.
Yeah.
And it, certainly, at least in my church and in my home, my parents were always like, let's just cut whatever's going on that's negative, we're just going to cover it up with these kinds of, positive Bible verses or positive, mantras. So I don't like to think of it as negative, but just as being honest. I'm really good. And this is something I really value in me and in other people now, which is, authenticity. Is this person being real about who they are, including their weaknesses, and including, if they have a bad day or something. And so when I look back at my former self, I see that I was doing that too. I was a lot, just covering up a lot of emotions that I was having that weren't positive, and that wasn't healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what's something that you learned or experienced that you may not have if you were still Christian?
I think that there's so much. Okay, I'm trying to think. there's so much, and that's a good thing. There's so much that I wouldn't have experienced. I mean, I wouldn't. Okay, so I wouldn't have gone back to get my PhD most likely. So, and I've learned a lot by being in this PhD program. Obviously, academic stuff, but aside from that, I've learned that people are really complicated, and I've learned, I think, how to really appreciate different kinds of people. And I've learned how to be independent because I decided not to go this route of, traditional femininity. Right now I'm single, and that's not to say that I want to be single the rest of my life, but just that I'm okay being single, and I'm okay having this, living this independent life. I live on my own. I pay all of my own bills. I have this, I'm getting a PhD. I also teach at the university. So I have like a professional job. So all of that is really cool and really empowering. I have done lots of traveling. Well, yeah, I mean, maybe I would have done that even if I was still a Christian, but I don't know. I think it's partly related to my lifestyle and stuff. So I've certainly had a lot more experiences just in general with let's just say, things that I wasn't allowed to do.
Sure.
I know.
Yeah, that's
I
fine.
don't want to,
Yeah, you don't have to say anything you don't want to.
Yeah, just had a lot of interesting experiences in that realm that I, wouldn't have had otherwise, that have been really good and positive. And I think also I've learned how to be okay with like I was saying before, with the chaos, to like be okay with the fact that life is unpredictable.
Yeah.
And that's taken me a while. It's taken me a while to get there, but I think I'm getting there.
Cool.
Now. That's cool.
Well, you have changed a lot over the years, from when you were a very devout Christian. You were, really involved with your church. The people in your life that you looked up to were these like perfect Christian women that, that you aspired to be, when you were younger. And now you're earning your PhD and you're politically very different from the sounds of your story. And so when you think back through that huge change in your life, there's always something, even though we change a lot during the deconversion process, there's always something that stays the same about us that's really positive, something about us that never changed. What's that thing for you?
Yeah, okay. That's really interesting. Okay, so I think it goes back to, this is interesting. So the basic Christian idea that you should treat people as humans with this kind of kindness and compassion. And again, I recognize that obviously in the history of the church as an institution, this is not always what the church has done, but at least in theory, the idea that, as Christians, we should treat other people as equal human beings, I think is really valuable. And it's something that I still subscribe to. And the other thing is vulnerability, which is interesting. So I know I just talked about how there were people in my church and in my family that sort of had this tendency to be sort of overly positive sometimes when there were, negative things going on. And that is true. But there's also, I think, in Christian fundamentalism, there's also this space in which you can be vulnerable. Like one of the things I really liked about our worship services was that there was often like a time for testimony or, like just sharing. And people would get up and share really personal things about their lives and often it involved weaknesses, like I'm weak in this area and I need God to heal me. And so even though I've now rejected the idea that God is going to be doing anything to help, I think the idea of being able to be vulnerable is still something that I really, really value, really appreciate in everyone that I interact with. So I look for in potential romantic partners. It's very big on my, my deal breaker list. And also in friends. So the friends that I connect, the people that I connect with are people who I feel are able to do that to some extent with me. Doesn't mean, like instantly when I meet someone, I want to know everything about them.
Right.
But just that there's that kind of, they have that ability to have those moments of being vulnerable.
Being vulnerable, okay. And then it kind of, like you'd mentioned the word authenticity, and I really liked that word earlier. Is it kind of get back to that a little bit? Just people who are authentic in your life?
Yeah.
And being that way yourself.
Yeah. So, so right now, So I guess I'll talk about it in terms of my like male friends. I think, again, because I think this is more interesting just because of like the gender sort of socialization. When I grew up, again, I witnessed men in my church being real. You could certainly use the word authentic, vulnerable, or authentic in these kinds of moments in the church. And including one of my closest male friends, who I'm still friends. He's still a Christian, and we're still friends. And he really modeled this well. So he would get very emotional sometimes, like just talking about how God is helping him through something. And so now it's so interesting. All of my male friends, even now I'm in this largely secular environment. No one that I really interact with now no one I know is a Christian fundamentalist. I do know some people who are still Christians, but sort of more of like the socially liberal Christians. But all of my closest male friends are guys who model that kind of masculinity, if you will, right? They're able to do that. They have the ability to do that. And for me, this is just really something that I try to enact on a pretty regular basis with my friends. Like I will, if I'm having a bad day, I'll say I'm having a bad day. If I'm really open about the fact that I struggle with anxiety, and I go to therapy, regularly, and I will, like I'm saying on this podcast, but I'll say that to people, pretty much anyone that I encounter. And I try to always be honest. Like if I get asked a question, I will answer it honestly. And it's interesting. It's actually cost me a friendship, although I think that was ultimately for the best. But it is interesting. So it's also not, it's not. But I think like I think I made the right decision. But I made a decision to end a friendship with someone who I thought was not authentic, for complicated various reasons.
So you would say just about yourself, though, that being an authentic person, being the ability to be vulnerable, that's something that you look back through your life and you see that as a positive trait that has carried through.
Yes. Yeah.
And what was the first thing you mentioned? I didn't remember, or I can't remember what you said.
So I said, it was the just the idea of recognizing the humanity of other people.
Yeah. And that's always been true of you.
Yeah, I think so. Like I said, I mean, I was certainly more judgmental than I am now, but I think that core kernel concept of, we need to treat others we're supposed to be embodying Christ's love when we interact with other people that has still carried over.
So there's likely someone listening to this podcast who's just deconverted. What encouragement or piece of guidance would you give that person?
I would say my biggest piece of advice would be to try to seek out other people that are going through the same experience, have experienced the same thing as you are going through this process. And you can, if you don't know anyone personally, podcasts like these and social media sites are really great places to start to get plugged into that community. I would just say don't be afraid to reach out to people. It really helped me and continues to help me that I have friends who have deconverted, because it's different than having friends who are secular. I mean, they're great too, but it's not the same thing. My secular friends, they just don't get it. and sometimes I have these conversations and I'm like, you're totally clueless, like about like what it's like. So I would say to people who are listening to make sure. I mean, it's fine to have secular friends who have that kind of secular background too, but I would say it's really important to find someone who has a similar fundamentalist background to you and who has deconverted recently or is in the process of deconverting, so that you can have that kind of support system.
That's great. Well, one of my next questions is, what resources do you recommend? But I think that would be a great segue into talking about your podcast. And I know I've taken up a lot of your time thus far, but I'd like to just hear a little bit about your podcast if you still have some time.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. So I have a podcast that I'm starting with my friend. Her name is Christine, and if you've been listening to this whole interview, you've heard me mention her a couple of times. And she and I are starting a podcast. It's called Forsaking Faith, and we are hoping to have the first round published in the next couple of months. We've got 2 recorded. We're working on the 3rd, but we want to publish a group of them all at once. So look out for that in the next couple of months. But you can go ahead and get plugged into our social media community if you want. And so we have a Twitter. It's at Forsaking Faith, and we also have a Facebook page, Forsaking Faith, and we also have a Gmail email. So it's just forsakingfaith@gmail.com. And so there's lots of ways to get in touch with us, and we're happy to talk to you. You can email us, you can post on our Twitter feed, and post on our Facebook page. And I guess I'll say a little bit about what the podcast is. So the podcast is, so Christine and I, we wanted to do this podcast because we thought that there's a lot of discourse in the atheist community on more of the logistical, intellectual sort of reasons why Christianity is wrong, or why, even more broadly than that, why any kind of organized religion is wrong, and that's all great. That's important, and certainly you should check those things out too. But so there's that, and then we also found that there's a lot of she and I both are in academic circles, and so we also found that there was a lot of like Christian bashing kinds of things, either tons. I mean, right. I mean, if you just Google this, there's tons of YouTubers and other podcasters and, people who just Christianity is a joke. It's the butt of a joke, or it's sort of even more cynical. There's people talking about, all of the horrible things about Christianity. And anyway, and so again, we don't disagree with all of those critiques or anything, but we felt like there was not a lot of space for a more nuanced understanding of deconversion. And since we've started our social media interactions, now we found that there are some people like you, Steve, who are doing this, and that's really encouraging and really great. But at the time we started this, we were like, no one is, who is doing this? Right. No one's sort of really talking about the nuances, and especially, like I mentioned earlier in my interview, the loss. That there is a sense of loss that comes with this, and it's not all. It eventually is positive, but it is a hard process to go through. It's like a breakup. It's like a death, and of a close loved one. I mean, it's just a major life change. So that's the reason why we wanted to start the podcast. We wanted it to be more personal, and it is. The way we've structured it is it's Christine and I talking about our own personal experiences, where we're very open about things, where we talk a lot about our emotions, the emotional side, the psychological side of the experience.
Yeah. So it's kind of like subject based. So you and Christine discuss different topics like related to deconversion.
Yes. Yep. That's correct. So we have the first 3 that we're doing. We have one that's about death. We have one that's about friendships. So we talk about how our friendships have changed through the deconversion process. And then we have another one on values, which is kind of getting to some of the questions that you were asking me, Steve, at the very end, which is like how, how have we restructured our lives around a value system, if we have one, and what are those now, and those is there any carryover from our Christian past? So and the other thing too is also we felt like there's fewer women who are outspoken in this community. And so we also feel really strongly that we have something to contribute, because as far as we know, we're the only podcast, at least, that we found that is hosted by women. We've interacted a lot with people on Twitter and social media, and they're mostly men. That's not a bad thing, but we're just saying, or we think that, we have something to contribute because we are offering a particular perspective. So we're excited about that, especially.
That's cool. Yeah. Well, I do know. Sorry. I know of one woman who had also had a podcast where she talked to other women about these types of issues, but has kind of discontinued doing her podcast, which is sad, because she was, to my knowledge at the time, the only woman on her own or only all female podcast that's out there. And we need like a variety of voices and experiences. We need that diversity, I think, within the atheist community or the agnostic community, the deconverted community or whatever you want to call it, I guess. It's super important. So it's really great that you guys are doing this. Especially since there's not much of it out there right now. Yeah.
Right. We're excited. Yeah.
That's cool. So you talked about a little bit about kind of why you started it, and then
yes.
And then the format. Is there anything else about your podcast that you want people to know about, or?
No, other than I will just say, for those of you who are listening who listen to a lot of other podcasts, we are trying to channel Anna Sale from Death, Sex, Money, which I don't know if any of you listen. I guess I'll do some free advertising for her. This is a really good. It's not a podcast that's about Christianity specifically. It's called Death, Sex, Money. It's just about a lot of different things. But the tone of the podcast is she's also very interested in like the psychological motivations behind people, and she does interviews mostly in her podcast, and interviews a bunch of different people on all different topics related to money, death, or sex. And anyway, so if those of you who are listening if you listen to a lot of podcasts, you probably know about this podcast. It's pretty popular. Then hopefully this is incentive to listen to ours. This is what this is the kind of feel that we're going for.
Well, that's great. Well, her name was, so it's Death, Sex, Money, but her name was Anna
Sale.
Sale is the last name.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So yes.
Cool.
I just did some free advertisement.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, let me know when I'll be watching social media, because I'm following you now on Facebook and Twitter. So I will be paying attention, but let me know when you guys, launch. I'm happy to like share it on social media and try to get the word out. And
great.
Yeah, it'll be fun to see, how it all develops. And have either of you, I thought you had said something about doing a podcast about death, but maybe you just meant you did an episode about death?
That's what I meant. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So one of our first episode is on dying, and then we've got on friendship and on values.
Those are great. Those are great topics, by the way. Anyway, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, and then we're still brainstorming. Like I think we want to do one on mental health specifically. We both feel really passionate about that. We have some other idea. Oh, we want to do one on. So Christine is a mom, so I think we're probably going to do one on parenting and how deconverting affects you as a parent or affects how you raise your kids. So if we do one on that, we'll probably do one on romantic relationships. maybe sex specifically and how our views on that have changed. So we have lots of ideas, but those are the 3 you can expect in the next month, hopefully 1 to 2 months.
Yeah, well, it takes time. It took me a very, very long time, more than I'd care to admit. It took me a really long time to kind of build the podcast, to get it ready. There's a lot of tiny little things you have to do, and more than I think the average listener would ever imagine. But and I'm slow, so slow at developing stuff. So it took me forever. But yeah, well, awesome. I'm excited about the podcast, and I'm looking forward to talking with Christine in the future. And thank you for taking time out of your day and for staying up so late to do this. I really appreciate it, and it was really great meeting you and hearing about your podcast and hearing your story as well. That was wonderful.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm very grateful. You had such good questions. They were really insightful and really got me to articulate some things that I don't think I've ever verbally articulated or sort of fully articulated. So that was really great, and I appreciate your interest and your support in our podcast. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Deconversion. Be sure to join us next time by subscribing to the podcast. If you'd like to learn more, check out our newsletter at bodpodcast.com.